All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to On the Count podcast. And I have two guests today, Mark Jones and Harold Ford. Our goal today is really we want to talk about prison reform and look into different things that happen. Um, those are coming out of prison as well. So we got a big conversation going on. Mark, would you introduce yourself?
Well, I'll start with my first real job out of college was at a prison in Georgia. I had an unusual job, not even sure that it exists in a lot of prisons anymore. I was a recreation supervisor, which meant that I helped with recreation activities. I coached the prison softball team. In my one and only year there, we were state champions. So very few people in the country that can lay claim to that. Not that anyone else wants to. I spent about 5.5 years as a probation officer and got a master's and PhDs in criminal justice. Been a professor of criminal justice now for 29 years and been teaching for 35 or so years. So my one of my interest areas is uh, challenges that face prisoners after they enter the community, as well as challenges that people face with a criminal record. So there's a little bit about me.
All right. We also have Harold Ford. Harold, will you introduce yourself?
Sure. Thank you, Pedro, for the opportunity. My name's Harold Ford. I'm actually an educator, 23 years in the public system. I started out in alternative ed, so my path with the I had a number of students who were actually at risk, and some of them were court ordered to attend the facility that I was teaching in. So my work with them and my challenges, as well as the rewards, I generally enjoy and often refer back to. In addition to that, I'm also the first vice of the South Dade branch of the NAACP in Miami-Dade County, where, again, we do a lot of advocacy work. As a matter of fact, we're in the process of meeting with our state attorney to deal with some of these very issues of prison as well as criminal justice reform and seeing what changes we can get them to make in how this process is going here and prayerfully create a model that can be implemented in other places. So thank you again.
All right, great stuff. And for those that don't know this, I am a retired lieutenant from the Federal Bureau of Prisons with 27 years. Also, I was a correctional counselor for many years of those. So that was what I did for many years, dealing from the inside. I worked from the inside of the prison, and that gives me a different view from everybody else. And it gives me on hand also. I was work with them. We did a lot of the stuff that assisting inmates returning back to life, right back to the real world, like they call it, just getting out. So our goal, at least my goal as one of those that been inside the prison or working with them, was to be able to give them something to grab onto, put them in the right direction, and give them as much information as possible, not just other things. We were in charge of security and safety. We were in charge of making sure that accountability. This is why it's called On the Count podcast, because on the count, it's a thing that we do all day long. We do count the inmates. We make sure everything and everybody's accountable. We do 5 official counts throughout the day, at least 2 unofficial, and throughout the month we have several different counts that we do all kinds of things to continue to keep accountability and maintain the system and things that are needed to make sure the safety and security of everybody is taken care of. So that's a little bit about me as well. Mark, you sent me some great stuff here. I love the information you sent me, but let me start with you. You've been a professor for how long, you said?
Well, 30 years.
Okay. What is the difference for you being a professor, and how that helped you being a professor and you had the chance to work in prison? How were you able to talk about those?
I think there are different schools of thought on the role that prior criminal justice experience can or should play in the academic world. We're seeing fewer and fewer people enter criminal justice academe that have previous experience in the professional world. And while most of those folks, including people that I work with, do a very good job, both teaching and in terms of research, to me, it just adds another dimension to my academic work. Now, on the other hand, there are some people that get too bogged down in the practitioner world. They can't make that transition from practitioner to academic. But with me, it's just really helped inform what I do. Most of my experience was in probation, but I did have that year in prison. Nothing compared to your time, your experience. But those are some very formative years for me. It, for better or worse, it may have shaped my personality. I'm not sure that how to go with that.
It does.
But it gave me an appreciation for what things are really like, as opposed to how things are portrayed in books and in research. That has a place too, but both one informs the other. Put it that way.
Yeah, what people see in the movies and they actually read in books, I would say some of it is a little bit exaggerated. Some of it can be very true. Some very few movies that I know have been very, very true or close to the truth, but some other ones that take it a little bit way over the top or has nothing that I'd be like, no, that does not work like that. It's just not going to work. So it kind of makes me feel like, people don't really get a real understanding of what prison life is and how it changes. It changes a lot of people that go into the system in both ways. It could change it for good or it could change it for worse. And it really depends. And I think that's one thing we want to also talk about today. Harold, changing for good, change for bad. What you think?
Again, I think when we talk about change, we have to look at the current dynamic that we're in, how we got there. Because I think, personally, when we started privatizing this system or this aspect of the system, that's when it became more problematic, in my opinion, because money became more the foundation and motivational factor than trying to turn lives around and turn people around and really minimize recidivism. And I hope I'm reaching toward answering your question, because when we talk about change, what does that mean? What does it look like? How do we retool this system, or is there a willingness to retool the system? Because right now, and I think I said in a previous podcast, when we look at our priorities as a society, we're spending $5 to $8 a year educating one child, and 30 to 50, depending upon the state that you're in, on average, trying to incarcerate an individual. So look at, how do you reform something that's making you so much money? And is there a motivation for, i.e., the CEOs of the companies, the elected officials that receive campaign contributions, etc.? How do we move the needle? Yes, there is a need for change, but we got to figure out what's going to be that factor that's going to be most critical to giving us the change that we need.
What scared me, and it just came to mind, that one thing that really scared me about private prisons, it's a business. And they treat it as a business. And what happens is, if I open up a private prison and I tell the government, for my prison to run, I need 30,000 inmates. That's giving me already, when I saw that and I read this, and I was like, wow, you got to have 30,000 people incarcerated to be able to run your prison. So you've given it a number that I have to have people incarcerated to run a prison. Wow. That gives me a whole new level of thinking when I saw that. I was like,
well, if I may, I'm not a fan of private prisons for the exact reasons you fellows just mentioned. I've never thought. I'm sure there's a decent one out there somewhere. I don't mean to impugn everybody who works in a private prison necessarily, but
Agreed.
my concern is not so much and I agree, when you introduce the profit motive, that brings in a whole other area of that's problematic. But I don't see that as the primary issue. I think what has driven prison populations, which are going down there, by the way, for the past 10 years or so, I think it's driven more by ideology than it is money. And so, say, for instance, back in the 80s and the 90s, during the heyday of the war on drugs, yeah, and people do profit from it. People do exploit, these opportunities. But I think it was driven more by an ideology that may have gone awry than more so than the desire for people to make money. It is because most of the prisons you're talking about in most states are still state operated, and most jails you're talking about are still county operated. And they're a drain on budgets more than anything else.
Yeah, they ran on a budget because they have a budget, but they don't have to maintain a certain amount of people incarcerated to be able to run. They're going to get the budget regardless.
Yeah.
But the way I thought about it when I read it, kind of impressed me was that you have to have a certain amount of inmates incarcerated to be able to run the prison. So that means you got to have those people. What do you do?
Not a fan of private prisons at all for a number of reasons. I think the bottom line to me is if the state is responsible, if the state has sentenced someone to a term of incarceration, the state should be responsible for their welfare and for the welfare of the public, not a private entity. I think that's an ancillary but related issue myself. I don't really think it really gets at the heart of what you really want to be about here, and that's helping the vast majority of inmates that are in state prisons and local jails, and that are getting out and having to go back in the community. I think private prisons are a small issue there, is all I'm saying.
Yeah, and you're right. One thing that Harold, you mentioned something that I wrote down here, the change in education. I think education is one of the biggest things that we lack in our communities to be able to effectuate that change in our community to make it, to give that background, to give something, that foundation to our community, especially now the children coming up, give them the education so they don't have to be involved in the things that our generation was involved and end up in prison. I don't know.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, when you look at the education system, there's a number today that we didn't have back in the day. I mean, now, with the standardized testing, now every time you turn around, we got all of these different drills, from a fire drill to an active shooter drill, to all of these drills that are taking place where we're actually creating more anxiety, less of an opportunity for that child to focus and function on receiving a quality education. But in the midst of all of that, you then had what has been known as the school to prison pipeline, where when we look at these annual assessments, especially in third grade, it started in Texas. It conveniently, because our governor was the brother of the former governor of Texas. He was the brother of the former governor of Texas. He also started a similar practice with our state standard testing, and they used third grade data from third grade students to use as a model for how many prisons or prison seats, quote unquote, for lack of a term, to prepare for. Now, if you're using an assessment to say, okay, this is what this person is deficient in, that's one thing. But now if you're using it as a model to decide, okay, well, we're going to need in the next 10 years, this number of prison spaces available, we're already creating a problem. And then through that school to prison pipeline, you're finding out that in many of these counties, a lot of them in rural areas and places, where you had judges that were on the payrolls of some of these, or receiving funding from some of these prisons to keep bodies flowing in. So, the corruption that transpired as a result of this whole process has also impacted certain communities. And I think Mark mentioned when we talked about the war on drugs, remember, crack was what? A sentence much differently than cocaine, even though crack is made from cocaine. But crack was available in a certain community that it was, whereas cocaine was more prevalent in other communities. So you have all of these variables that come into play when we talk about prisons and sentencing, and we're not getting into disparities of sentences at this time, but when we look at this, all of these different dynamics, all of these different variables, it's very complex, and it's going to be hard to focus on how do we correct this problem, because it's in so many places that it's almost like we got to break the system and then rebuild it so that it can function optimally and not the way it's currently designed.
Well, if I may, let me just chime in something, because we very often, and Harold used just now, we say the system. Notice I'm using air quotes, the criminal justice system, and the thing about it, one of the interesting thing is that the criminal justice system was really more a result of a kind of a compilation of historical accidents. If you notice, our founding fathers in the Constitution, the term criminal justice or criminal justice system is nowhere mentioned. That's because the notion of local law enforcement as we know it, let alone federal law enforcement, really didn't even exist. Penitentiaries, as we know them, didn't exist. There were some holding facilities. Probation and parole, as we know it, didn't exist. The only part of the criminal justice system as we know it now that was in existence then was the courts. So there's a lot about the courts, but nothing about a criminal justice system. That term didn't come into use until, say, the 1920s. And then we started to recognize that, look, this is all interconnected here. The cop on the street and the paroling authority are connected, but very indirectly. But they're still autonomous, and that makes it both good and both challenging, because a sheriff can't tell a warden what to do, and a warden can't tell a judge what to do, et cetera, et cetera. So it's a loosely confederated system, and that's good, but it's also bad in some ways.
I like that.
Yeah. And I think, it's a continue to evolve as time goes on, and how we try to figure out, because you've been a professor, and you can study back, and the thought of prison and what gets people into prison kind of changes every 10, 20, 15 years. I say every 20 years, somebody comes in with a new trend of thought, and they put it in, and it kind of changes the whole system, how they're going to look at it. The system did look back in the 80s was totally different. The war on drugs put in a lot of people in prison. I know in the federal system brought in a lot of people, and also brought in the other thing that we had, and this has probably not related, but we had a lot of issues with when Cuba let a lot of those inmates out, and they landed in Florida, and they ended up in the prison system. So they created a whole new realm. It was crazy in the 80s as well. But in the 90s, it changed. And while I was working in the early 2000s, a lot of the thought changed as well. Again, one more time, we started doing new things on how to prepare the inmates to get it out on the streets. And not everybody was, accepting the new trends. And then 10 years later, again, they revert to some other things. So it kind of changes as the constant change, we cannot be able to sustain, and we are not able to figure exactly what to do. And one of the things is getting them, and I think the biggest thing is getting them ready to get back to society. And I think that's where we fail the system. Not
Absolutely.
just the system inside, it's preparing them to get out.
Well, you're right. Ideological and philosophical trends do, waver over time. I was a probation officer in the 80s during the war on drugs era, and even though I was in Georgia, we got some of that Cuban boat lift situation you talk about visit itself in Georgia, even on probation caseloads. I know it really hit Florida hard, and it hit our prison systems hard, particularly the federal system. And then, the war on drugs started to kind of wane a little bit, and now we're a bit more emphasis. We place more emphasis on trying to assist offenders than we did in previous eras, but that ebbs and flows as well. And there's probably less drug enforcement, and that may be the reason, or one of the reasons, that prison populations have declined in the past decade or so in most states. But we still have an intractable problem on our hands, and that is, when people get out, what do? And you worked in the federal system. Now I know you guys work hard. I'm not saying you don't, but state systems are just so overwhelmed with numbers that it is very difficult for prison staff to really do what they should do to prepare people for life in the community. And they'll tell you that. I mean, they check off the blocks. They have a release plan. In other words, where you're going to live and so forth. But how much time are prisons able to get at the root of what got that person there? And very often, I always say that the two biggest problems we have, if we could eliminate or deal with mental health issues. Notice how to say mental illness, Harold. I said mental health issues. All right, and addiction. If we got a handle on addiction and mental health issues, we'd have a lot of unemployed people in the prison and criminal justice system now.
What you got to say, Harold?
You hit me.
All right.
You kind of beat me to the punch, because I was actually going to raise up the mental health piece as well in my next comment. But, looking at it from an education standpoint, and knowing that I work with children with disabilities, and some of my children it may be physical, but at the end of the day, some of it may be emotional, mental health that they're dealing with. And what happens when that child, or when that young adult, or when that adult who suffers from those challenges has an encounter with an enforcement officer who's not trained in understanding or de-escalating that type of individual. And, no, you're not going to have the perfect cop, or I do apologize, the perfect law enforcement officer, because I hate the term, but sometimes it's in the back of my mind.
Oh, they're okay with that.
You're not going to have a perfect law enforcement encounter, because there's so many different, again, variables that come into play. But if we don't do our best to train officers to spend more time de-escalating and understanding that child or that young adult may have just had something that triggered them to go into that level. And if they had been Baker acted and taken to a hospital and observed for the 72 hours or whatever the period, timeline is for that whole process, then we could possibly reduce the number of people going in. But as you alluded to, and I think it was Mark, if you do that, no, I think Pedro said, if you do that, now guess what? You're jeopardizing the profitabilities of some of these incarceration locations, because they need numbers.
That may be true. Sorry, I'm sorry. I still think the private prison issue is not really that significant, because the state-run prisons are glad when you funnel people out of there. But you raise an interesting point about law enforcement encounters with people with mental illness. Now, first off, Harold, I know you work with children with mental health issues. We also have to remember that a lot of the people that get into the criminal justice system, those mental health issues don't really manifest themselves or don't come about until they're adults. Now, you have to talk to a psychiatrist or a psychologist to get more in the weeds on that. But one thing that more departments are trying to do, and have been doing for the past few decades, is implement something called CIT, and that's crisis intervention training. And that is how to deal with a person who has a mental health issue, and how that person does not really understand. Some of them don't understand, boundaries, borders, do this exactly as I say so. And as a result, the officers don't know how to deal with them. So, but that training is intense, and it takes a long time, and it takes a lot of money. And it's also important for departments not only to give that training to officers on the street, but officers in jails who have to live with these people. And just understand, and this, some results have shown that if an officer has CIT training, they are less likely to engage in, say, deadly force or lethal force with someone who has a mental health problem, because they understand. And that's not being judgmental of the officers who don't have that training. They just don't know. They don't know what it's like to hear voices in their heads. Okay. So
right.
The more training and education officers, and that's not just being disparaging of officers, but it's important that everyone who deals with that population understand that population, and that the mentally ill population is different from the overall population in a lot of ways.
Well, I worked with mental health for many years as well in the prison, and the advantage for us was I usually try to work with the same group of inmates. I will take a housing unit, and we try to stay in the housing unit. I like to ask for the housing unit because then I can work with those specific inmates, and I knew the mental health inmates and the changes. And if I saw a change, I knew what to report because something usually changes before something happens. And we are aware of this, and we watch the behavior. We keep a book, we keep the information, we pass it on to the other person. Hey, I was watching such and such. He's not acting the same. He's more quiet. He's more boisterous. He's giving away his items. He's doing something that he doesn't do every day. So that gives us a little bit of advantage being inside of a prison. But also, you talked about policing. What I think about policing is that has changed so much is that people don't, the police officers don't work the communities like they used to work back, I would say, 40, 50, 60 years ago, when we had a police officer that knew the people in the community. And I knew, the police officers knew who was their drunks. Okay, we know you're gonna be drunk on Friday night. Let's see if he's okay. We get him home, or we'll put him in the cell, lock him up. We let him out a couple of days. When he's good to go, he don't cause us any problem or anything like that. But the community has grown. Then we bring people from other places. Officers come from other places, don't know how the community act. They don't know how to deal with this person or the person specifically, and that causes a whole new world. Well, I don't know how to deal with him. I know he's mental health, but maybe I don't know he's mental health. Now, and you see this all the time. It's just not knowing how to deal with it and not even knowing the person. Here I come into a community, and I know Big Bubba has, issues, but I'm new in the community. I don't know. I know Bubba is a big guy, and he just acting a little bit off. He's violent. To me, that moment looks violent, but maybe he's not. He just looks that way. That's the way he acts because we are not used to that. So learning how to do that as officers, I think that will be the other part in the training. I mean, we got to train, and I think that's also for police officers being missed out is just training them and giving all the information they need to have to be able to do their job.
Well, it's understanding that when a police officer or a detention officer or a correctional officer, as the case may be, if they tell a person, you go over there and sit down, and when they don't do that, the officer or the person given the instruction immediately thinks they're being belligerent or uncooperative. But if the person is CIT trained and they recognize symptoms of mental health issues in the person, they will understand the person. They may not be being belligerent, but they just can't. They can't follow clear instructions, understand clear boundaries the way that perhaps some other people can. But you have to be trained to know that. Do I know if I were put in that situation when I know? No, I wouldn't. Even with all my education, I don't have as good understanding of mental health issues, most likely, as either one of you guys. So you got to be trained. It's not innate. You have to be trained.
I got a question.
And I agree with you 100%. I'm sorry.
And not just a question, but a comment about, officers moving on. And that's another thing that we also have, that we move officers from one location to another, and they never get trained. They never learn how to do these things. And again, they're back in a new community, and all they bring is the same baggage with them to a new community, and they're not retraining. And some of them just don't want to be trained. I'll tell you that. But some of them don't want to be trained. Some of them do want to be trained. There's a lot, and I believe the majority of officers want to be able to perform at their best. So training should be available. That should be without a question. Harold, you got a comment?
Yeah. I was going to say, kind of jumping on that comment as well as a few others. One of the problems that I think we have in trying to gain public trust when it comes to law enforcement is the fact that you see law enforcement officers involved in a situation, that they've wronged. Right now, we've been looking into a situation where there was a rough arrest not too far from my home, by a number of officers on two Black people in the community. Well, we need to understand, why was that necessary? If one officer is holding him down, why is the other officer punching this guy in the face? It's just, certain things are not in the manual that I know. that I've been exposed to, and maybe Mark didn't like me as well as you, Pedro. There is a process and protocol that when an individual has been handcuffed or is in a situation that they're not a threat, I don't see why if a defenseless receiver can't get hit by a cornerback, why is this individual who you're in the process of apprehending, being punched in the face when they can't defend themselves? And if they reach to defend themselves, they get hit with resisting arrest. But when you have those quote unquote bad acts they're often referred to, they seem to move from department to department to department in other jurisdictions and other states. And at some point, the going after that officer's certification may be warranted, because if I revoke your certification in Florida, it makes it more difficult for you to go now to Minnesota or to Illinois or anywhere else to work in law enforcement. Now, I would hope you'll be able to find a job doing something else, but everybody's just like everybody's not equipped to be a teacher. Everybody that's in law enforcement is not gifted and equipped to law enforcement. And I feel it's a calling, and not everybody is worthy of a calling, because they do it more of a disservice and make the 90+% of the other officers look bad or seem questionable to the community. And if you want to build trust, whether you're going to, as you had George Floyd's situation, have that officer, convicted and in jail or in prison, you're going to allow these other officers who may do lesser. They may not have murdered or killed someone, but they may have done something that's almost egregious to the point where they've totally violated that person's civil rights, harmed them physically, hurt them, physically and or emotionally. And now they're allowed to let me leave this place and go on to the other place. And it makes me think of, and I hope I'm not offending anybody, it's almost like what the Catholic Church and what's recently come out with the Southern Baptist Convention has done with priests and pastors who have had multiple reports of violence against the public, violence against individuals, doing arrests or apprehensions, and nothing was done. So if we want to build trust, we're going to have to eventually address that issue, because that is going to be an elephant that stays in, that's going to be hard to remove from the room.
I think one thing, back to the question, which you addressed in part, or I just have another angle to put on it. The officers moving from department to department or city to city. I don't know how. I know that goes on. I don't know how much of it goes on interstate, because I would think that, in other words, going from, say, Florida to Minnesota, as you say, because if one were certified in state A, say Florida, and then wanted to go to be a police officer in another state, they would have to go through an entirely new certification process. And some can do that, and there's some reciprocal agreements that allow for that to be done rather easily. I think what's more common is, particularly in larger states, say like Texas and Florida and New York, is going from, one sheriff's office to a neighboring city police department, or one small city to another. There's a lot of kind of fruit basket turnover. And it's not necessarily because every time a cop does that doesn't mean they're bad. Sometimes they just move and change jobs. But
I agree.
Yeah, and sometimes if an officer in state A, has done something egregious, as you say, then the state can withdraw that person's certification. Now, the question is, how much does the state know about why that officer left? And that's when it gets into, well, the officer didn't kill anybody. The officer was not seen on some viral video, which we all see nowadays. But they did some stuff that we didn't like, and so we're just going to quietly dismiss them. And perhaps no one really knows about the real reason they were dismissed. That goes on quite a bit. But how much of that is the root of our problem? Yeah, I don't know. So I turn it back over to our host now. So,
well, yeah, it's a bit of a problem. I don't think it is the whole problem. I think the other problem is we have lost respect for law enforcement and what they represent. Also, they have lost the trust of the community. And I think that's a big, big thing. When we were growing up I'm going to go way back in, 40s and 50s, law enforcement, you respected a law enforcement officer. I know growing up, and I grew up in the 70s and early 80s, So law enforcement, it's a job that had respect. Nowadays, you see it, and a lot of people don't respect law enforcement like they used to. So that's an issue. The other issue is there's so much available out there for violence, and the job has become difficult for the guys on the street as well. So it's really a balance. It has become such a big balancing act from both sides. The community and the police, and how to police the community. Also, us teaching those police officers how to do better for that community, but that community has to do better as well for the police officers. So it's been a big balancing act in that part. But also, and we gotten a little bit away from our other topic, was those guys coming out of prison. Okay. I mean, we talking about all this, but the biggest thing, we got a lot of people that do come out of prison, and they have to create their balancing act, because now they have to deal with those police officers. And what's the first thing the police officer is going to look at? Well, you are a convicted criminal. You're coming out of prison. You're a felon. So anything that goes wrong, who they going to knock first? On whose door? They're going to come knocking at his door first.
Let's back it up. Let's back it up a little, Pedro. I think that and while your ex-con, does tend to get labeled by the cop and so forth, I think the bigger and more immediate problem this population faces are their more immediate problems, and that being a job, food, shelter, and a support system. When those things fall apart, that's when they encounter the cop. Okay, and all that process starts all over again. And so how do we equip people that have drug problems, have all sorts of issues? They may have very few job skills. How does the prison system prepare them for life in the community? And I can tell you, but again, you work with the federal system. Federal system has better resources and has smaller populations than most state prisons and local jail. And so it's an impossible challenge for them to do anything but just warehouse those people for the term of their sentence. And the best they can do to prepare them for life in the community is just find out where they're going to be living. But as far as the job goes, as far as the support system, there may not be one. Jobs are hard to get. And then that takes us to the issue of collateral consequences. What are the collateral consequences a person pays beyond serving their sentence, either in incarceration or in the community? Whether the collateral consequence is imposed by the government by saying that you can't work at this job, you can't work at that job, or whether it's informally imposed by an employer who says that I'm not going to hire you, and that's my right because of your criminal record. And that's where we really, and then we have people that are shunned by their families because they burned those bridges, either because of their drug addiction or because of something else. So that's one reason that population just keeps going back over and over and over again. It's just a vicious cycle. What do we do about that? I don't know.
That's a hard question. I mean, because Harold, you got something in mind. I got something. But I want to hear what you have in mind, Harold.
I just raise questions. I don't have any.
No, that's fine. That's fantastic.
Yeah, and I love it. The bottom line for me is, as an educator, I see education as being the most valuable tool to overcome a criminal record. If I show an employer, yes, I committed this act way back when. Since then, I've learned that I can take this to the next level. I can help make you money, I can do this, and I can do that. I guarantee you that employer will give you a second, third, and fourth look if they have to. But you got to bring something other than baggage to the table. Not only that, but our prison, again, I'm trying to change my vernacular since Mark says in system. we don't want to go there. But our institutions should also have stronger emphasis on education. If those individuals didn't take advantage of education from preschool to 12th grade, I got you as a captured audience now. It's an option. You want to reduce your time? You need these classes. You want to do your time? Let's work on getting this degree or getting this certification. I want to get you a skill set that when you walk out there, you can now turn your life around, as well as the community that you came out of. Because I mean, I looked at Freeway Ricky Ross. He was part of the whole Iran-Contra scandal with the selling of the drugs here in, the United States. And he was able to turn some things. But at the time, he was making so much, it didn't matter how much damage he was doing to his community because the drug money was coming in hand over fist. Once he got in prison and realized all those people he made rich, not one of them came to see him. Not one of them helped contribute anything to him while he was in there. And he realized he had to make some changes. And on this side, he made some changes. And then other stories that we've heard of where individuals went into prison, where it was under the right set of circumstances or the wrong set of circumstances. In other words, being falsely accused or rightly accused. But I think if we focus on getting these institutions to get a deeper dive and look to provide a stronger education or platform while people are incarcerated, and incentivize it such that when you do this, you could have a job there for those that are formerly incarcerated. You have programs out there that pay employers that hire people that were formerly incarcerated. So again, build on something that's going to help communities build those individuals, then turn this thing around. It's not something that we can't recapture. We can recap again. What is the motivation? The motivation for going back to private prisons is recidivism. It doesn't benefit state and federal prisons if you come back in or not. The space is going to be there. They're going to get paid regardless. For private prisons, they know if they don't have the bodies, they don't get the bread. And so they want to keep them inside as much as they have you come back. But I think education is going to be the key to unlock this whole situation that we're concerned about as it relates to the prisons, conditions, the prism, and where we go as a society moving things forward.
Well, Harold, you mentioned money quite a bit, but I'll take that too, but I'll from a different angle. All right. Now, where I'm coming from is, all the things you talk about, investing in education in the prison system, investing in vocational ed programs. I know of an inmate who told me, and you'd be surprised. Well, maybe you would be surprised, but we wouldn't. But a lot of people would be surprised at the number of adults in prison who are illiterate, cannot read or write. Now, what was happening in school all those years, that's kind of a separate issue. And how one inmate helping another inmate just to read, basic reading skills. But see, the problem, it goes back to money. But the money, in this case, being taxpayers' money. And legislators are, on both sides of the aisle, are very timid about saying we want to pour massive funds into rehabilitation of prisoners. That's fraught with all sorts of risks because people will say, well, this person that committed this heinous crime, they went through this program at this prison and so forth, and they still committed the crime. You never read a headline about an inmate succeeding. Day 5 of Johnny not getting arrested never makes the headlines. So right. It requires a lot of money and a lot of education, but mostly money, and that's money that the public is not really that willing to part with because there's no love for prisoners out there for one thing, and because the results very often are very checkered, and they don't want to take a chance on something that may not work. But what they don't realize is it's garbage in, garbage out. If you put a person in and just warehouse them, and try to do no help whatsoever, well, guess what the end product's going to be? That same person, only worse. But now there are people, though, you can just put and say, look, you need to sit in time out for a few months, and they come out and they're okay. We don't know who those people are.
Right.
But the fact is that, again, I think the federal system and some state systems are the exceptions. Their numbers are so overwhelming, they're so understaffed, and that they really can't do very much other than to warehouse a person. And the other thing we're neglecting here, and we're not talking about federal prisons and state prisons, what about local jails? You guys have kind of made a mention already of people who spend months, weeks, months, sometimes even years in local jails awaiting trial. They haven't been convicted yet. Some of the largest penal institutions in this country are county jails in places like Cook County, Illinois, and Los Angeles County, a humongous population. Mm-hmm. And they spend a lot of time there. And there's your revolving door there, too. That population. What do we do there as well?
And that is that right there is one of the most difficult things is dealing with that population, because you don't have the staff and the system organized enough to be able to separate, let's say, by age. Sometimes you have younger inmates with older inmates that really doesn't work, or
Well,
you have
yeah,
you have your you guys there are really they are predators, and you have them around younger guys, so they that turns into a whole new notion. You have the guys that run in the gangs, you got all the other stuff, you got your drug addicts, you got the ones that want to you make it. That difference in those county jails is where it begins, and we can't they haven't been able to make that work because, like you said, they don't have enough. Usually, they don't have enough staff to do this, and it's a revolving door because they might come in, and it really depends on your pocket. You got money to get out.
Yeah.
You pay for your bail, you get out. You can't pay for your bail, which is the majority. A lot of people can't pay for the bills, and they're there for simple stuff that should not be. They didn't have to do time, but they end up arrested. They ended up in that county jail. They ended up doing 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 months, and their life is turned upside down because now, like Marky was saying, now they got to get out. They don't have a job. The family support is gone. They lost what they had. Now they got to start all over, and they don't have nothing to start with. Okay.
And very often, particularly the case with young men, they're going to go back to the same environment that helped put them in prison in the first place. And
Exactly.
I know one of the things that you got that I showed you, Pedro, to look at. I don't want to get off on too much of a tangent here, but not only do released inmates tend to fare worse than the general population when it comes just to basic life skills, there's a body of research, and not just a study that I helped conduct, that says that it's very clear that recent released inmates die at a higher rate than the general population from all causes. And one of those things is drug overdoses, because a person that's been incarcerated, now they do have drugs in prison, we know that, all right, but it's harder to get. And so you have a person who has a drug habit, a drug addiction, and when they get out, their tolerance is messed up. And so they're more likely to overdose in those first few weeks after they're released than they would have been before. So they die in higher numbers from drug overdoses. They die in higher numbers from suicide because of mental health issues or because of despair, and from homicide, and from accidents as well. So it's a very at-risk population. I always say that, all we have to do to solve the crime problem in this country is take every 13-year-old boy and lock them up to their 30. But that's not likely to happen anytime soon. But that, of course, that's tongue in cheek. I'm just kidding. But again, dealing with addiction and mental health problems, it's a very, very tough mountain to climb. But that's what we have to do.
Mm-hmm.
It is a tough mountain, but like Harold, I think one of the biggest things that we get away from is the education of our population. And we came to that conclusion we always come back around. It seems like it's one of the things that is the biggest foundation that we can create for our society. Educate them, because if you give them the right education, they can build on top of that, whatever it is, either the job, entrepreneurship, going doing different things, but they have something to build on. But we got to give them also the right education. And we know Harold, that education is not always the same. Some people can get great education and some other people can't. The one thing that I've known from me working in prison, those that didn't have education and that switch turned over in their mind and said, I got to get educated. And they did everything possible to get that education while they were in prison. And those are the guys that I know, the majority, not all, but the majority of those that did that switch while they were inside the prison system and were to go and get some education, whether it was, I'm going to read more books, I'm going to learn about this, I'm going to talk to people that's around me that's more intelligent, I'm going to change my situation because I can't go back to doing what I was doing the way I was doing it. Okay. So those guys, when they make that switch, you can see them succeed. It's not easy. It's not easy, because that's one of my goals also with the podcast, is to bring some of those guys. I continuously get in touch with some of Mark. I have a lot of inmates that have been released, at least that I know of, from both state and federal. And hopefully we'll get the opportunity. I would love to continue this, and we'll get to talk to them and for them to share their experience of success, what they did in prison, and how they got that, and how they were able to overcome those situations, whether it was family, housing, religion, all those things that you also have mentioned before. And I read from your article you sent me. So definitely would love to talk to all those folks. Main question that I love that both of you mentioned, and this is one question that I will ask inmates: how did you get here? We also talked about how did we get here by the system, but I always ask, I got to ask that one time. I asked that to one of the prisoners, an inmate, and he looked at me with his eyes wide open, his face lit up, and nobody ever asked me that. Exactly. I've been locked out 10 years and nobody ever asked me that question.
Yeah.
So he told me the story of how he got in the system, what really happened. And everybody has a story, and those are stories I also want to bring forward whenever I get a chance.
Pedro, I think that I was thinking right before you said that, this very thing, that people that work in the system, whether it be academe or whether it be in the correctional system, they don't listen to inmates because, hey, look, me officer, you prisoner, you be quiet and listen. But one of the things I made a point to do when I was teaching an online graduate course in corrections, and I had people in the course, the students in the course, most of whom were employed in the system, they're CDA professionals, but I made it a point to invite a young man to do an interview with me. We recorded it online like this, who was a former inmate, and he has served several years for some robbery offenses. And he said that very thing you just said, that nobody really got to the why of why I got locked up. Nobody got to his basic circumstances. I think it's pie in the sky for us to sit here and say, okay, well, the answer is, lobby the legislature or Congress for more money, throw more money, throw more money, throw more money. I think instead what can be done is local and state governments and the federal government too, for that matter, can create incentives for people to work with released populations, such as giving tax breaks in some places, some governments do this, giving tax breaks to businesses who hire former inmates, or giving some sort of incentive to landlords to take on inmates and let them live in their facilities. Because that's another problem they got, is housing, because a lot of places will not accept people in housing projects or apartments that have criminal records. And so their fundamental problem is, where am I going to live? And if I'm shacking up with somebody, I may be here illegally or living with somebody I shouldn't be with. So we live in a democracy, but I wish sometimes that our government would kind of lead by carrot and provide some carrots for businesses and landlords, et cetera, to offer assistance to people that need it, this population we're talking about.
Yes. Harold, last thought, because we are coming here.
Well, those are my last thoughts.
We look at this enormous. When we look at the enormous engine and institution that we have, that's prison, it's tied to so many elements of our country. When you look at our communities, when you look at who are in the prison and their journey to get there, you look at some missteps and mistakes that may have been made along the way. We look at the fact that we live in a dysfunctional society.
Yeah.
Within that dysfunctional society, we're going to have dysfunctional people. And some are going to, I'll tell anybody, I was young. I made some bad choices.
Oh, yeah.
But it was only by the grace of God that I didn't get caught up. As a matter of fact, I was in a store that's no longer even in existence now when I was growing up. And my nephews and I, we were walking around the store, and I saw a wallet that I liked, and I put it in my pocket and walked around a little bit, and I took it out and I put it back off. And when my nephews and I went outside, we got surrounded by 5 police officers. We didn't know. Where's that thing we saw you put in your pocket? Now, they saw me put it in my pocket, but they didn't see me when I took it back out. And I explained to them, I took it back out, I put it on the shelf. Well, show us. So now I got to march you back in the store, take you back down the very aisle, put it on the shelf, because I didn't put it back where I got it from, but I put it back on the shelf. So you saw one aspect of that interaction, but you didn't see the complete interaction or circumstance. So we showed it back to them. They allowed us to keep. Now I'm just thinking, if I had not and made a poor choice of keeping that item, which doesn't mean it didn't happen in other circumstances, put myself on Front Street, but if I hadn't, what would my life be today? I have no idea. Because I could have instantly been pushed in. And I know that when a young Black child gets pushed into a system, it's a hard road to get out of that system.
Yeah, agreed.
Because of all the different things that go around that whole process. God only knows, you feel like you're already born a criminal, when you're born Black American, just being transparent. You feel as if you're born because you see individuals of my hue criminalized quite a bit. But the goal is, what can we do now as a society to transform ourselves so that we can become that beacon of hope in the world to say, hey, listen, America is the greatest country. This is how its citizens matriculate through it or journey through it. And then what we are able to produce in society. And those that make missteps and mistakes, those same individuals, now we can show society, hey, listen, this is how we correct those that make a mistake and help polish them off. Because what we're looking at really is a diamond in the rough. And if we could only put enough pressure around it and the right types of pressure, we'll see everybody flourish. But until we get to the point to where that is a focal point, we can pour any amount of education, we can pour any amount of money, we can pour a lot of things into it. It won't come to fruition. And my hope and prayer is that we can come together and do what is needed for all citizens so that, as the Constitution says, we can enjoy the benefits of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So again, as we look in this journey, and thank you, Pedro, for allowing me to come through. I appreciate the opportunity, and I'm here anytime you need me.
All right. Well, thank you both, Mark, Harold. I say it's been a pleasure having this chat, and I hope that we were able to pick this up and also bring in, like I said, I do know some inmates that are out in the streets have been out 10 years now. I know some other ones that have been very successful. There's a lot of other people out there that have become very successful in different fields. They will not mention that they were in prison due to the fact they get stigmatized quickly and people will look at them a little bit different. But there is a lot of people out there that I will love to get the opportunity to talk to them and bring some other people. Maybe we can start looking from different sides of the coin and see how all this can come together and probably make a better system, or just redefine what justice and the prison system is and how we can look at it and how to make it better. So that is the goal for the On the Count podcast. That's what I created this for. So it's been a pleasure one more time. Hope to see y'all soon and continue this conversation and have some more stuff. Because, Mark, you got some great stuff that you send me. I want to talk more about that. And Harold, education. All right. Well, thank you, everyone. Hope everybody enjoy this On the Count podcast. We are accountable for each other, and we are accountable for what we do. We are accountable in this as a nation, as a population as a whole. Have a great afternoon. Hope to see y'all soon.
Take care.
Take care, everybody.